All right. Thanks, guys. Um, so I was thinking today we can just dive straight into it. But as I was thinking, how best to start it, I know we reserved this towards the end, but a word just popped up in my mind. And it was something James had said the last time we spoke. It was that one word, multitude. And then that kind of took me down the string of like, multiplicity, multifaceted. And then all of that just, linked back to Anton's work. I was looking at the website while he was talking, and it seems like it's just a bunch of different things coming together. And it kind of shows that you can kind of branch out into different areas and still find common themes or commonalities that bring them together. And that is through connections, right? Through being, through presence. We've spoken about this in previous Sandbox events as well. And I was thinking we can start by just being present, and that's why these 2 minutes really help being here with each other. And I am very excited to hear about the work you do, Anton, and how you came upon it.
I think because I've got a bit of time, I'll start from the very beginning, which is I was born in Moscow to a Russian father and a Ukrainian mother. And I think one of the things that has shaped my life is that we were a first generation family to move to the UK. And as a result, we didn't have any of the social connections or sense of community or even that cultural heritage that so many people have when they live in the country they were born. And so in many ways, we had and my parents were also very young and they were still figuring things out and they were coming into a new country, a new environment, a new culture after the Soviet Union fell. And as a result, I think, we really missed that sense of having grandparents around and friends of friends and that sense of really knowing the people and the place around you. We were kind of just jumping between suburban towns and then getting into schools. And I think that when I look at my childhood, I don't really look at it in a very happy way. Like I was fine, I was safe, I got good grades, I moved on. But I definitely didn't have a wonderful time. I wasn't, I look back on my childhood and think, well, it was a means to an end. But it was not the happiest time in my life. And I think that growing up in a kind of town, suburbs, where predominantly you're driving around in a car, you're in this terraced, semi-detached house, middle class-ish. But I really felt that this was now that I think back, not a great way to grow up. And that everything was dominated around driving to different places. And we didn't really have that sense of community or tribe and I knew very, very few people that were my kind of elders. So almost no grandparents or people of that age, maybe your teachers. But yeah, in a class setting, you don't really build a friendship or relationship with them. You just go to school. And so that's kind of what I grew up with. And I went into university and also struggled to find my way, didn't really find my place. And it was only until I left the system and that I actually began to find my feet and actually figure out who I was and what I wanted to do. And I have quite a critical view of education and the way that our society has been designed and built, because it really doesn't provide very much support. And it doesn't give you the kind of, I think, the skills you need to thrive. So I finished my architecture degree, UCL, just the first 3 years. And I said, well, 100% I don't want to go into a profession. I'm going to try and figure this out myself. There's no point going and being an architect or getting a job. I needed to figure out how to make some money on the internet, which is generally the smart thing to do if you're young and don't have any experience or any credentials. And so I kind of taught myself web design. I started with clip art, which was terrible, and then self-taught Illustrator and Photoshop and kind of figured out how to make presentations and hack together a logo and a website and pitch lots of ideas. Initially, my dad covered rent for the first year, so it was relatively low risk and low stress to just run around and just attend events and try things out. And I look back and the majority of the things that I produced and the ideas that I pitched were really awful. But I didn't know that at the time, so I was kind of ignorant in my bliss. And it meant that I could keep having the confidence to keep going to the events, keep trying things out, keep building my skills. And eventually I realized that, yeah, I could probably scrape by with a few little freelance projects, but I needed to team up with someone with more experience. And so someone that I kind of met as a mentor, then I joined his project, Good People. It was a social enterprise, and found that I was quite good at building stories and building narratives and doing fundraising pitches. And so we got quite successful at that, working with kind of Channel 4, Big Lottery, The Shard, BT, on lots of different social action projects. And did that for a couple of years, learned a lot, but also was quite naive and young. And eventually left that, set up my own thing, working predominantly with startups and helping them raise investment and get kind of improve their product and improve their customer base and get into an accelerator program or stuff like this. But I was still bouncing around a lot between, tech for visually impaired people to help them wear kind of augmented headsets so that they didn't have to use desktop stuff, fintech business that was trying to make education more affordable, business schools. I worked with them. I don't know how I managed to get a consulting gig for 9 months with a business school with no real experience, but hey, I figured out how to tell a story, facilitating co-creation workshops and designing stuff and prototyping ideas. But I definitely felt that even though I was managing to find work and doing lots of things and connecting with lots of people, I wasn't necessarily where I needed to be. And it felt that I was doing a lot of things very, very randomly without a kind of direction or purpose. And at some point I got an invitation to go to Burning Man. And so I gathered a group of 4 of us and we went there. And the festival was awesome, but actually the thing that was more powerful for me actually was what happened after the festival, where I stayed for 10 days in a co-living in Oakland. And I saw how they built a community from the ground up. The house was about for 20 people, and it was artists and entrepreneurs and creatives living together in a very intentional way. And I really enjoyed that and said I wanted to do something similar. And very, very quickly, I got an invitation to go to Sweden and open a collective house. It was a hotel in the middle of the city, and we had 55 people living together under one roof, which was quite exciting. And so we framed it as conscious co-living, and we kind of, I helped out with the interior design and also the recruitment and onboarding of the community. And yeah, it's also where I met my wife, and so brought me a lot of good things. And eventually, off the back of that, I started to really return to my architectural roots and look at property and real estate and bring all the skills that I've learned from startups and social enterprise and apply it to this kind of slightly old school, slightly conservative industry that is building houses and offices and cities. And what I found was there was this wonderful sweet spot between the world of architecture, where designers predominantly focused on the buildings, and developers that predominantly focused on the spreadsheets and the numbers and kind of getting things through planning. But no one was really owning the customer experience. No one was really thinking about the user flows, the services, the whole community and human experience of these buildings. It was just like, how do we get the money to build something? How do we build it? How do we get it through planning? And then it's someone else's problem to figure out how people live there. And that obviously was a big gap that was missing in a lot of these complex projects. And so I would come in and say, well, we need to take a service design approach. We need to do workshops with customers, with stakeholders, and we need to really, from an early stage, really start understanding what is the story of these places, and also what is going to be the lifestyle that people will live here. And it's amazing how little time is spent actually talking about the human experience in these big, sometimes £1 billion projects and redevelopments of hundreds, if not thousands of homes. how little time is given to understanding the human element, and how much time is spent just focusing on the business and the building and the planning and the numbers of it. And so I came in and did that piece around master planning, kind of coming up with creative uses of space, but also the subtle elements of how you market a place and how you onboard people and include them in the process of property development. And that was super fun and well paid, which was great. I could build up my savings. And eventually I realized that it wasn't enough just to consult. I needed to be on the other seat of the table. I needed to learn how to be a property developer from the very early stages. So I, once again, in a similar way, I find someone that has the knowledge that I am looking for, that I kind of get on with, and I ask them to be a mentor. And then I tell them about all my crazy ideas. And then we kind of become friends. And eventually, Alan then introduced me to a guy called Nick Simkin, who was a big property executive for many, many decades. And he was setting up his own firm. And I joined Alan in the team. And my role is kind of creative director in focusing on the placemaking, community branding side. But even though that's my role, actually the real reason for me to do this was so that I can learn from the best, understand how planning system works, understand how to finance projects, and learn how they think and how they work, because they have so much wealth of experience. However, though, as much as the kind of day job that I work on, I think we can make a decent impact in terms of how people live by providing much more interesting places, not just dead housing estates, but really look at how the ground floors work and how we deliver good services and bring kind of nature and landscaping into the projects. Ultimately, it's a very profit-driven business, and there are certain constraints that we have as a company. But where my kind of real passion lies is actually taking those skills and applying them more broadly, and in particular looking at regenerative development. Basically infrastructure and housing projects that actually support the environment rather than exploit it. And I think for a long time, I felt this very strong disconnection between communities and culture in the city and communities in the countryside. And this disconnection, I think, is a fundamental problem to tackling climate change, but also to helping tackle mental health, and also helping people reconnect with themselves and the nature within us. And the fact that you either live in the city or you live in the countryside, I think, is a broken model. I want to live in both. I want to have a foot in both places. And so House of Transformation began with visiting a mentor, which tends to be the way that things happen for me in my life, as I kind of ask people to be mentors, and then I meet up with them, and then somehow very randomly connections happen. And just as I was about to meet a mentor and catch up after a kind of 6-month period of not meeting, I overhear this conversation at the Conduit, which is a kind of social impact members club. And I hear this guy saying he's a farmer and a property investor and also an entrepreneur. And I was like, okay, I need to speak to you. And I got his card and information, and then I messaged him later. And apparently he told me later that he had a dream where he said, I really hope that you should meet this person, you should do stuff with this person. And that's quite fun, how instinctive it can be sometimes. But he also shared this belief that there was a disconnect between rural and urban, and there was an opportunity in bridging these networks and coming up with new models of farming and new models of housing that kind of integrate the two. And really it started with just a bunch of conversations where we didn't know if that was a business here. We just were interested to learn from each other. And we met up a few times, and then I was learning about all of his investments. I think he's invested in like 50 companies with like 8 exits, all in the kind of impact, clean tech, ag tech space. So it's really inspiring. And initially Circular UK was like, hey, you should brand your investments. I think you do so much in circular economy. Well, here's a logo for you. And then he was like, well, it's really kind, but he likes to stay off the radar. He doesn't need a website to get deal flow. But then that kind of evolved into, well, let's just use Circular UK for a project that we do together. And let's start a space in London where we can effectively do what the Conduit do, but just a little bit more intimately, and experiment with this kind of multi-use space model where you not only have work kind of 9 to 5 co-working and kind of office hours, but you can also do something really fun on evenings and weekends. Because it's amazing how pubs are closed during working hours, and bars and actually offices are pretty much empty and dead on evenings and weekends. And why couldn't a space do both? So that was really where we got to. It really was just a conversation. There was no real business plan. There was no real kind of like thorough, how is this going to make money? It was just, we believe that rural and urban circularity was going to be something really important for the world, and we wanted to work together. And so the second I found a space, which convenient was literally right above where we lived, it was just, yeah, cool. Let's do a design, let's get it priced, and then let's figure out how much. And he provided a loan of £30,000 to just fund the fit out. And it was a fun process because we agreed a heads of terms with the landlord, but we only got the keys in September. So we had 2-3 months to design it in 3D, run workshops, pre-cut, pre-order everything, so that the second we got the keys, we can go in that day and clean the place, sand the floors, change the lighting, and then a week later, all the timber arrived, all the CNC'd plywood, and then we just screwed them into boxes. And the entire space that you can see on the website, hotspaces.org, was built basically with a group of friends and some carpenters, and we just built boxes and then bolted the boxes together to create a house within the space. And the vision was always that it could be a dance floor, a restaurant, an office, a kind of wellness studio, all wrapped into one. And that we would be able to offer so much more than just an office with desks, but a chance to kind of really have a space that was designed specifically for workshops and for collaborative co-working. So, there's a real chance. It's kind of, I'll show you a little bit. There's as you can see, beautiful high space with smart lights that we can change, breakout areas upstairs, a little guest room, and a big widescreen projector behind me. And it was always meant to be an experiment in how we can bring people together, how we can fuse together kind of art, music, sound, food, all these things to start a conversation about how we can live differently and work differently. And the plan was, once we set this space up, to then go out and meet farmers and landowners just outside and speak to them about how we can transform their business models and help them transition to a more regenerative agricultural model, but also to build housing in nature. Because so many of us actually, if we said what would be our dream, it wouldn't necessarily just to live in the city forever. It's to have a place in the city which we can call home, but actually to build our homes out in the wild, where we could create art in the forest, where we could grow our own food or participate in growing food together with others. And then, our kids can grow up in this kind of community, nature-inspired environment. And so that's what we've started to do now, is I've partnered with several landowners, and in particular one that owns an entire village estate of 5,000 acres with a lake and a forest and a marina, a big castle hall, beautiful gardens, and the infrastructure that can really be a modern place to live in nature. And we're exploring how we can get funding for natural capital funding to help him transition away from kind of more intensive, unsustainable farming towards a much more high biodiversity approach. And also, how we can get more people in the city to visit the countryside, to co-create events, to grow their own food, to build their own housing, either whether it's tiny houses or kind of more permanent houses. I think the ability to kind of design and build your home with others is a very powerful thing. And I think where we've got to now is it's still early stage, but I think the space is here, and it's going to be really exciting to tell that bigger story. I think what I've learned from the process is how you don't need to have all the answers figured out at the beginning. I think the key is to be able to tell the bigger picture story and to anchor on these fundamental themes and kind of core beliefs. So it all started from, there's a disconnection between the countryside, nature, and the city. How do we rebuild this connection? And in doing that, we can open people up to a whole new way of living and working. And also what I've done a lot of research in is what's happening in the rural economies. And farms are struggling. Farmers are struggling. Brexit, volatile weather, being addicted to this kind of industrial farming system where you sell into supermarkets and grow a lot of one crop. You see a huge loss of biodiversity, loss of insects, a loss of animals, loss of everything really. And these farmers are seeing this decline as a result of those farming practices. And they want to change, but they don't necessarily know how to fund it. And also what the new model will be like. And so coming and telling them a story of how their farm can still be a farm, but it can be a farm of the future, which is also a village. And that actually it can be a hub that will attract talented, ambitious, creative people to want to go and build their dreams in these places. And I think that there's so much opportunity in terms of converting old barns into co-living, co-working spaces, creating alternative models of agriculture. Mushroom farm production is really interesting to also get your teeth into. And bringing kind of energy and resources into the countryside is so important. And ultimately, my dream is to be able to help build a village where, you have a modern way of life embedded in the forest. You don't have to live isolated alone where you have to drive everywhere and have access to wild nature. Why can't you live a modern life with people who share your values and interests, but on your doorstep is a beautiful forest, some of which you help plant, some of which that exists. I think the biggest obstacle is figuring out which places to focus, where to put your energy, forming the right partnerships, and then accessing the right financing and business models to make it possible. Because I think it doesn't work if it's just one family buying one house and doing it up and having a few glamping tents. It needs to be a bit more than that, hopefully a lot more than that. But I think that this movement is taking off around the world. People are realizing with lockdown that they're not reliant on the city, and also that the city isn't necessarily the best place to be all the time, and actually what could a more balanced lifestyle look like. And it's going to be really exciting to see the events that happen here at House of Transformation. That yes, people will dance, they'll have cacao ceremonies, they'll do meditations, they'll meet and talk and hang out, but also they'll begin this conversation around how do we live better, how do we eat better, how do we have more connection to nature. And I think that's when it becomes something more than just a space for people to hang out and play. It becomes a movement, and potentially even a way of life. And I think that myself, going back to where I started, I grew up in a very isolated suburban, kind of outer London neighborhood. And I think what I want to try and do is recreate that, reinvent that, so that we do it in a much more sustainable, regenerative, and fun way. And we're at the beginning of the journey, but I do think that this is going to be a big movement. And the reason for doing Rebuild was because there's a few friends around the world that were thinking on similar lines. And we thought this was a great opportunity to bring everyone that's working on this together and have a global conversation, which we can then apply at a local level. So where we're at is, just starting to open up to events here for the first time for a while. And it's predominantly going to be sound healing, morning dances, kind of dialogue dinners where we all have one conversation over a table with a sharing platter of food. And then different workshops around how we can build regenerative places and projects around in East London, but also outside in the countryside. And yeah, hopefully in doing that, a lot of really interesting things will happen and emerge. And yeah, once you get your teeth into the business of it, and not just the idea of it, it becomes quite complex. It becomes a lot about, yeah, just breaking everything down into small pieces and then figuring out how much each of the pieces are going to cost and what is the right piece to start with. That's kind of the principle of real estate I've come to learn. And then you earn the right to then make a beautiful invitation to people to then be a part of a project. But there's a level of hard work that's needed to get to a place where there's something tangible and real to hold on to. And so I've been kind of focusing on getting a space, because that's something tangible and real, establishing that key partnership, and then also understanding that it's not enough just to come with a dream. You also need to back it up with a business model and real skills that will enable it to happen. But yeah, I'm feeling optimistic. It's going to be an exciting summer. And yeah, hopefully that gives you a sense of a little bit my personal story and the journey of setting up House of Transformation.
That was amazing, genuinely, Anton. That was really great to hear. And Aliche is like the heartbeat of Sandbox, and she was just like the whole way through. So there's a lot of themes that you covered, and you beautifully interwove them. And I think, for me personally, I think the transformation that's kind of necessary in our day and age is not in a static discipline, but it's in the way it flows between the different disciplines. And I think the fluidity of the projects that you're talking about and how they connect to very important nodes in our society, I think is very inspirational. And I don't just say this for you, but I say this for the potential of, if we had a few people doing this, the impact is I think is phenomenal. So I just wanted to start sharing that, what was coming from my heart, and I invite everyone to share from their heart, and then we can go into questions after that. But I think you've just touched on so much. It's like questions that probably don't do it justice. So I'm going to pass the baton on to Aliche.
All right. Thanks. That was really great. Yeah, I agree. All right. Thanks. That was really great. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you were saying. It's a big dream also for me that I think about a lot. And I don't know, really like looking and observing how landscape is being built. And yeah, and this I come from a really small village in Italy, of like in the middle of nowhere. You need a car to get anywhere. Nature is everywhere. And then I moved to London. So I have these two extremes I grew up in, and then I left London, and everything after this is such a, it's like, there's something in the middle. There are lots of things that are not these two extremes, and small cities, for example, or big towns, or and what you're saying, like building or creating new villages, or I don't know, there's different ways of getting to it. Or you take a village that's already there, and then it happens to like have the right people at the right time arriving, and then starting to create something new and making it more alive, more collaborative, more engaged with each other. Or you have a city, and then you try to make the city more green and more village-like. Or you have a forest and people buy land, and then they make a project there. a house project, but then to make a village. Yeah, I want to make a village. And I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask later.
Who would you like to pass it on to? Because this is the first round. They're muted, but I know they're here. Steph and Lucy also.
Stefika.
I have to be quiet because I'm quarantining in the government hotel, so we're both having these like calls, and the dinner came, and there's a lot going on. But that was beautiful. So many great insights, and really nice hearing your full journey and everywhere that you were coming from. I feel like I'm not the right person to be here because I have a twin sister who's a manager at the Collective, which is another co-living space, and she's just about to join another co-living space. And my boyfriend works in agriculture, and I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't know anything about this, but they would be. And I was like furiously texting my sister, like, come and listen to this guy speak. So yeah, I also have questions, but I think I will wait until we come to that part to find out a little bit more. But it was lovely.
Also, so sorry we jumped in late. We had another meeting first, but this is Bertan. I'm Lucy.
I also do have a lot of questions. I also resonated a lot with what you said about just, finding these flaws in education and then kind of picking up on that and seeing how you can fill those gaps rather than kind of just saying, okay, well, the way people are taught in school in their formative years is flawed and that's it, So I really resonated with that point, and it reminded me of a project I had come across when I was at UCL and I was figuring out what to write my thesis on, and it was a farm project called the Clitter House Project, where this person called Patrick Kirwan decided he wants to teach students in the farm. That's the best classroom. And like he was talking about the fluidity of spaces, which is also something Kiran touched on in our previous sandbox. So I just saw recurring themes here.
Could you write that down in the chat?
I will.
His name.
I'll send you the link as well.
That'd be great. No, I think that there's a certain skill set that's required for village building, which is to develop an ecosystem mind and to really see the connections between things. I think that we're taught a lot to specialize, and there's a role for kind of specialism. And also in business, if you're looking to scale globally, it makes sense to do one thing really well and to scale it through tech. However, I think villages don't work that way. You can't scale villages, right? And villages are so anchored in the place that they're in. And actually, the skill set that's required, a village doesn't thrive, just like a farm or a garden doesn't thrive if you've just got one thing. It needs lots and lots of things interdependently working together. So the ability to think in terms of systems, the ability to kind of learn fast and be able to kind of almost copycat and integrate existing models and technologies and businesses, but apply it in a local context. It's ability to hold complexity, and it's the ability to integrate solutions that already exist. And ultimately, of course, tell stories and bring people along with you, which is the same for anything you do. But it's that ability to go into the detail of lots and lots of different things and then try and figure out how they fit together that is fundamental to this. Because if you're just building housing in the city or like the Collective, it's relatively simple, right? You're building student accommodation, you're kind of selling it as a slightly more premium product, and then you're offering a bunch of events and services around that. I think that I think there's a limit to what you can do there, and it serves a market. It is what it is. But I think that when you go out and you start thinking about how nature works and weaving how nature works into the way that you approach design and community building and also the business model side of things, it becomes quite interesting. And it's just a magical thought experiment as well, of that you learn a lot from the process. And I think the thing that is exciting about this is that this can be a lifelong pursuit of inquiry and exploration. And you'll never stop exploring this question of how do we live and how do I want to live? And it will change over time. And yeah, I think there's something powerful in just creating art in nature and creating space in nature is really beautiful. And being able to also play with your physical environment. So often, I think this is maybe one of my critiques of the collective, is they create a polished service offering, and they don't really allow for people to play or change things, because it's just the average stay is like 3 to 6 months, and you don't really have the scope or the freedom to really co-create. I think it's a service department, really. And although it's better than nothing, and they're profitable and they do a good job in what they're doing, I do think that there's something unique about village building that is about, listening a lot more to who's living there and working with the land, and kind of becoming a student of nature as well, which is a fun process. And ultimately, the skill set that I bring to all of this is assembling teams, very interdisciplinary teams, and trying to kind of very quickly understand each area and how it fits together and how it's financed. And that's so super important, because to create a level of comfort that isn't just a kind of little camp with some tents and a converted building or barn. You do need to go through, you need professional skills, and you really need to think through how you fund these things and how you, kind of bring people on board at the right time. Because just having a group of people that want to live that way at the beginning can actually become a nightmare, because if everyone wants to be a philosopher, then nothing gets built. I think there's a lot that can be learned from festival culture, and the way festivals are built, and how to make that more permanent and more resilient and more sustainable. But yeah, I think it comes down to that ecosystem mindset of being curious about lots of things, being able to make connections and recognize how to assemble teams together. Because if you just have a farmer, you need someone that understands all these parts and can weave them together in the right way. So that's the best advice, is to be willing to go into the detail, be willing to do your apprenticeship, be willing to kind of go and meet people and listen to how they do things. And before you know it, you become the expert. It's just how life works, right?
Hi, yeah, I think that it's a really beautiful, interesting idea, and so much of what you said I've heard echoed in so many of the communities that I've been coming into contact with, whether that's like traveler communities, whether that's protesting communities. Like, it seems like these ideas are coming up more and more, of like having both the social sides of the city, but also like the connection with the land and food resilience that the connection to the countryside gives us. But I think what I'm slightly concerned about, and the bit that like makes me fearful, is building these systems still within the framework of a transactional system. Like, it feels like to me the most resilient communities that we're going to be able to build are going to be outside of capitalist framework. And I know that sounds quite like radical, but that is like what we sort of have to be doing. Like, I feel like these community structures only work when people are really doing things for the good of community rather than for a money incentive. And I also feel like the idea of like shared workspaces, like that feels to me like, as a young person, I just don't see a career in any way, shape or form. As much as I would love to, I just don't think that that's what society is going towards. And I feel like our ideas, like, for me, my big concerns are food resilience, community like uplifting, making sure that everyone's mental health is looked after, and that we have the ideas of social justice instilled into those communities. And if that does come down to just being a couple tents in a converted barn, do you know what I mean? And I feel like we really need to think about the framing that we are putting around these communities. But I don't know what your feelings around that are. But yeah, it's super interesting work. It's been really interesting too.
It's a tough one, because if you step outside the system, that you can't change it, you separate yourself from it. And I mean, it's a tough one to answer. I think that ultimately you're going to need resources to build something that has more ambition, right? There's certain things that just require resources, skill sets, materials. And I don't think that taking investment is necessarily a bad thing. I think that you can repay your investors, and there's a lot of really long-term investors out there, and you can actually accomplish a lot with that resource that will then enable you to do so much more. And I think that the vision that I have is I do want a place, a village that is of a certain kind of scale and has a certain level amount of infrastructure attached to it. And even creating a food forest, to do it properly to the point where it actually pays its own way, it does require between 50 or 100,000 to do it well and make it self-sustaining over a number of years. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of money out there that wants to support this work, and it doesn't necessarily have to be at the expense of the values of the community. I think the two things, if there's strong communication, if you've thought through the business plan and the business model, then it's necessary to be able to take on capital, to be able to build things in the right way for the future. You know, because there's many examples of, yes, you can hack it together for a bit, but it actually becomes more expensive to maintain a badly built system that you kind of did with mixed knowledge, as opposed to doing it properly from day one. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of existing properties out there, a lot of funds that want to support regenerative living, that want to shift to new agricultural models that see these problems. But equally, for them to transfer the money that's required, they need to have some level of return. Now, I'm not talking crazy returns and ridiculous profits, but some level of, you know, just because they won't be able to deploy the money otherwise. And I think you can be very creative in how you create shared governance structures, how you could share some of the profits. And ultimately, there's a balance to be had between rewarding people financially for doing good work, with also not creating an exploitative model where, you know, there's very, very big developer profits, and actually then it just becomes unaffordable for people to own their own home. And I think that I think we're each going to approach this question in our own ways, and we're going to come with our own skill sets and our own ways, philosophies. And so you can do it with the totally grassroots Amish way, and I'm sure it can be beautiful. I want to do it in a slightly more business-driven way, using my skill sets, and create a place where, yeah, I think that kind of works for a modern family. And I also know that I don't want to be a farmer, but I want to be around a wonderful farm, and I want to help support people that do want to farm as their livelihood. And but there's ways of doing it that is smarter and more effective. And I think that's about doing your research and weaving together the skills and technologies. And yeah, it's I think that my take is have one foot in both camps. You know, one foot in the super hippie kind of anti-capitalist camp, but also one foot in the more corporate and kind of business camp, and see where you fit. And sometimes you're going to be at this point of the spectrum, and some points you're going to slide this way, and it's going to change as you get older and as life changes. And it's about recognizing that there's no one right place to be on that spectrum. You're going to feel what's right at any given point in time. And actually, I've always developed that kind of philosophy of not being too ideological in what I do, and trying to, yeah, kind of recognize that the reason why things are the way they are was for a reason. And there is a good reason for that as well. And yeah, it's trying to kind of be mindful of being able to, have one foot outside the system, one foot inside the system, so that you can be more effective in life. I think I've learned that over the years.
Thanks, Anton. I'm going to build onto that. I think Lucy raised a fair challenge, and it's something that popped up in my head as well, that the whole, you know, like you said, having one foot in the very hippie anti-capitalist side, and then the other one in the more kind of investment driven, where you're engaging with different stakeholders. Um, how do you, like, do you find different, like almost like you're speaking a different language with each? And how do you actually, do you have to kind of tailor your words or kind of speak their language to have them kind of buy into it, or not buy into it, but like engage with your work itself? That's my first thing. And the second part kind of follows on in terms of, you know, how you see the people who engage in your project, right? You're saying the people who come around and dance or take part in these workshops. Do you see them as co-creators? Do you see them as clients? How do you talk about them?
Oh, I mean, definitely co-creators, and definitely it's a very personal thing, creating a village with people. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people that come through the space that will be inspired, but will do their own thing. And I think that I understand that ultimately, yeah, there's a core tribe that will stay, and that takes time to build. And that's very personal to me as a person, my family, my wife, my partner, and our group of friends. So, but then there's also a wider movement and conversation and exchange of knowledge and skills that I want to be open and support others with. And I think that coming back to the first point around language, I've almost become recognizing that there's no point in opening up to community until you've done a certain level of work. You know, there's plenty of people, oh, it'd be great to create a community and we open the space. It's like, been there, done that. You know, do the hard work, find the land, find the building, get it financed, set up the framework. That's the point. Then you invite the community. But there's a lot of stuff in between that it's hard enough to do it. But when there's a bunch of people that don't necessarily have the knowledge or the skills or have their own ideologies or agendas, and they're all trying to be part of the process from the very beginning, the build phase is not a time for sitting around in a circle. You know, the build phase is the time to develop skills, work with professional people, and get to a point where then you get the opportunity and the privilege to then open the circle. You know, absolutely no point sitting around and in a vast group of people, potentially even that don't live in London, and to talk about, wouldn't it be great to create a house of transformation? And what would we do there? And if there's so much that you just need to find a few particular partnerships, get the ball more, do that first 20% or whatever it needs to be, or even 80%, to the point where then you can create the container for co-creation. And then you take your time and you enable the relationships and so forth. And what I try and do is, there's some steps that's worth taking just to get to a point where it's a real project. And then to really think clearly about who you invite and when and at what time, so that there's no confusion there. Because if you're inviting someone into a dream that you don't even know what that is yet, then it's going to be a mess, because you're not ready to invite them. You don't even know what it is yourself. And so then they make a bunch of assumptions about what they've been invited to. And then eventually along the line, there's this clash. And then, yeah, it then turns into a big mess. And I think there's a lot of personal work that is needed to be done to realize when to open up to a group co-creation and when to close down, and then figure things out for yourself. And then what works, how to set up the business side to then enable the community side to flourish. And I learned many of the hard ways that if you try and do both together and you mix them, it becomes a really big mess. But if you organize and think through and do the hard work, then you can generously create the container and people can step in. And that's where then you can live out your values. And I definitely believe that once you move from build stage or inception into a funded project and open the door to many more people getting involved, that's where there's going to be a bunch of people that are going to get super excited. And I've been one of them, and be like super keen and yes, I'm going to do this. But then after a few months, they're off doing something else and they don't follow through. So to take your time in including people gradually, based not on what they say, but on what they do and how they behave day in, day out. And I think that ultimately communities work when there's a small core group of people with a very clear defined idea of how they want to live and work. and then they open up slowly. And the invitation is clear, and you get your agreements in place early, so that there's no room for confusion and ego to get involved, and it starts becoming very, very messy. So that being said, when it comes back to the language thing, I'm pretty much focusing right now just on figuring out the business models and figuring out how do you actually partner with landowners, because it's so much easier to get things to work with existing infrastructure than trying to build everything yourself from the ground up and finance it. So get to a point where through partnership, we kind of leapfrog a lot of those steps. And if we can partner our way to a great village infrastructure and then bring people in the right way at the right time, with also the right economies, because these rural places will only thrive if people can also make a livelihood. Of course, some people can make money off cryptocurrency and off digital freelance work, but it's not enough. You also need to have a thriving rural economy and regional economy. And so working with stakeholders, being part of conversations. And I think some people really love that type of stuff. I do. Some people, they get bored with planning and regulation and construction and all these things. And that's okay, because some people just want to create art and grow food and be in community. And that's wonderful. And I want to be around those people too. But there's some people that really like to build stuff and work through all of these kind of technical and business challenges. And I love that. And so that's what I'm focusing on. And eventually the two will meet in the middle. And I think that it's important to not confuse people on the business side, because that also will just shoot you in the foot. And I think there's a lot of landowners that if you come to them and say, hey, this is our dream, it's great, that's your dream, but what problems can you solve for me? How do you help me? And if you come instead with the idea of like, let's understand what your needs are, let's help you develop your farm and be more resilient for the future and generate and bring you investment, then you're going to be much more willing to then open the door to our dreams and our ideas. And so leading with the gift, leading with real business value that we can bring through our networks and our skill sets will then make it so much easier to then go make things happen. Because like starting from a flat piece of land with nothing and no infrastructure, that's hard, right? It's to make that to a level of comfort that people want to come and stay for longer periods. So, but really it's really this early stage that so many of us are in. And I think this is only going to become more and more important. And if you start researching and building your networks now, it's going to be so useful in 5-10 years when you're going to be having the money to invest and the time to invest or starting families. Because I really think that you can get by living just a kind of city life and occasionally going to festivals when you're in your 20s and maybe early 30s. But the second you have kids, cities are not great places to live. They're not designed for kids. Kids are really just an afterthought. And from the work that I do, no single developer is building housing for families. They might say they are, but really where the money is building lots of small flats for young professionals and renters and workers. And it's a terrible place for families. And then you'll push further and further out. And if you're in the fringes of the suburbs, why? You have to drive everywhere. Why not go into a beautiful paradise and work with farmers to regenerate their land and create much, much cheaper, actually, housing that really works for you. And I think that's just such an obvious thing. And the more people talk about it, the more they realize, yeah, what waste of money to buy this kind of crappy flat in the suburbs when we can pull together and with the right support and structure, build it ourselves. And slowly planning legislation is opening up to these ideas. And there's tactical things you can do on the ground to make it easier. But it is hard work. It's like dedication, many years, lots of trial and error. And yeah, I think that, but it's worthwhile because it would be very, very beautiful if you, just like with this space, coming here every day and just looking at the paintings that I painted and and seeing people come to the space, it's a really fulfilling thing. Sharing tea and seeing how it's all come together. And I think it's one of the most spiritually powerful things, actually, the creation of space and the building of a physical world, not just a virtual one, and being able to impact it, influence it, play with it. And yeah, I think that a lot of other people feel that passion too.
Oh, I mean, now there's so much has been said, it's a bit like overwhelming, but it's great to okay, again, it's a subject that I think about a lot, but it feels like you've just, I don't know, I feel like I've been put on another level of like planning or like creating a village or a world as if you were cooking, and then you have a pot, and let's say first I need to get the space, so you choose the pot, and then you assemble teams, and so you're like, I want a bit of this today, or oh, this is the time for this kind of person, and wow, this is like making a film or making it's like the Truman Show, but no, it's because it's impossible.
I do love the Truman Show. It's a great film. My partner Morgan loves it too.
And there's this big like I've been really interested in favela, because I don't know much about them, but they are interesting because they're basically just like people making villages from scratch, building everything, making the infrastructure, and the people that end up in these villages are often violent and everything, and that's why then they become violent. But I've been like, oh, what if you have a favela full of creative like I don't know, very constructive, collaborative, peaceful people. So I don't know.
Can I share something, Aliche, back and forth a bit? I kind of the idea of, does the space make the people, or does the people make the space? So if you're constructing a space where people are boxed in like a city, right, or they're boxed in like a favela, and the resources are low, it could potentially create more tension. It's not guaranteed, but it heightens the probability of that. Whereas if you have a more spacious space where people's needs are needed, you know what I mean? It's like, where do we start first? Is it like, do you start with the people and like hope the people are great? Or do you consider the space and how that's going to mold the people? And I think this ongoing conversation is really interesting because a lot of justification for the staticness of our structures is people are just the way they are. The cities aren't shaping people, the economic structures aren't shaping people, people are just people. But if our position is that actually people can really thrive if you create the conditions for them, then you start to move into a different direction, right? And it's not going to happen overnight. It's not like you're going to take someone who was a serial killer, put them in a beautiful space. It probably does help, but they're not going to change overnight. And that's kind of just something I wanted to throw out there, because I could tell you're on a flow of consciousness.
The Churchill quote that first we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. It's quite used a lot. And I think that ultimately you need a dance between the two. I always say that the best design is left 20% unfinished, deliberately. And I always encourage developers to deliberately create as open plan, as flexible space as possible. And then, in a more practical way, how do you make sure that you can clear all the furniture out and open up the space and then bring the furniture back in? And how do you make it easy for an event producer and, building out a stage, but there's storage behind, right? And the storage underneath. And then you're thinking about, okay, where do you move the chairs? So what chairs are easy to move? How do you adjust tables? How do you be able to create an art exhibition, but then a dance floor? And so through these jigsaw puzzles, you can actually create walls that you can then take apart and move somewhere else when you need to. So I think that there's a lot that you can enable by anticipating how a space can be used. And often if you don't put the Lego blocks there, then they're not going to build, no one's going to build the structures and sculptures. So it's a little bit you have to anticipate, but equally you have to observe, because you're not going to get it all right at once. So that 20% of unfinished, which is why I think that's where places like the Collective, rather than trying to necessarily guess with Old Oak all the different things that people would like, and then create all of those spaces, and then I'll sell them and market them. If they'd left all of those rooms unfinished, and then invited people into a process of then co-creating the themes, the styles, and they would have learned so much more, A, and also people would have had a much deeper connection to the place. And so I think that there are certain things that you can just say 100% are just good decisions to make, and you don't need a group to come around and make that decision, right? It's, just very obvious functional things. But when it comes to that next layer of decoration, of how the space is used, even the branding of the space is done, it's such a shame that everyone rushes to do that up front, and therefore you're kind of imposing an idea as opposed to letting it emerge. And so there's a dance. There's a dance between leaving things open, but also doing enough that people want to engage. I think, a blank canvas can be scary. And I think that there is a role for the founders of any project to set the vision and values and tell the initial story. And ultimately you're creating a container. But what I've tried to do with House of Transformation is make the container very, very flexible, and also open up to even more ambitious projects in the future. I think that you'll know, and ultimately it all starts with yourself and a journey of self-discovery and inquiry. Because deep down, the anchor question to all of this is, how do you really want to live? What do you really, really want? What matters for you? Because if you're going to go through all of this work and effort and do that hard graft, know that, so that it doesn't turn into something that you actually end up hating or actually despising. And it just gives you stress and gets you out of alignment. Because a lot of these community spaces can be incredibly overwhelming and can be really exhausting to do. You have lots of people coming in and there's a lot of attention, and you end up burning out and actually running out of resources, and it becomes very difficult. So a lot of it starts with that kind of inner inquiry around, why are you doing this? What really matters to you? And recognizing that, some things you're just going to want to have a certain way, and you're not going to want to budge, and that's okay. Not everything has to be co-created and open to discussion. And I think that often a lot of groups get together and have an idealistic view of how things are governed and how decisions are made. And that's okay. But I still feel that it's important to know what you want in this process. And I know that's going to clash with a lot of people who look at that differently, but that's where I've landed in my journey in my life. So I may be a little bit more on that side of things. So.
Great. Thanks all. Thanks, James, and thanks, Anton.
Cheers.
See you for the next one.